Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining this evening for the analysis, which is always an awaited thing. This time we are also projecting on the YouTube channel, so we understand a lot of people are joining YouTube also. Of course, we lot of people that we have heard, they have a lot of different analysis, but today we have the experts that we are very keen to know from one from the tax point of view, Mukesh Bhai, and the economic analysis from Dr. Ravindra Dholakia. I am given a pleasant job to introduce them. Mukesh Bhai and Ravindra Bhai do not need any introduction, but I need to do the protocol. And maybe I'll need to do that as a protocol, maybe for just 1 minute, sir, if you permit. Yes, Dr. Ravindra Dholakia, experienced teacher, researcher, trainer, and he's at IIM Ahmedabad, MS University, and several other places. His research interests are macroeconomics, growth, and development. So we know that his analysis that will help us in dissecting the intricacies of the budget. Of course, he has been part of the high-powered policy-making committees and member of Monetary Policy Committee of India, Sixth Central Pay Commission, and many other expert committees. And he also, of course, an independent director on many boards, including the Central Board of Reserve Bank of India. Mukesh Bhai, of course, we know part and parcel of Ahmedabad Manage, the foundation, I would rather say. And he is the man who is taking this marathon to ultra marathon for all the years that everybody, all of us are listening to him. Since I was actually a school child, I can relate myself, Mukesh Bhai, with these guys that I was attending as a school when I was hearing you also, as many years that I have been hearing you and keen to hear you. Mukesh Bhai, I cannot introduce him from the because but I need to do this two-liner that, of course, apart from his expertise as an international tax expert and advocate and 45 years experience, he is a prolific writer and speaker, 4,500 weekly columns in English and Gujarati, 50 editions of his book titles, and more than 500 TV shows. And certainly every single show has an insight in it. So thank you, Mukesh Bhai and Dr. Ravindra Bhai Dholakia. We look forward, of course, budget. Most of them will say balanced budget. Some of them, of course, will say imbalanced budget. Someone will say inflation. And of course, Mukesh Bhai, we are very keen to see your analysis on the math of the tax rates that everybody is very keen to understand that what is this default new tax regime and how does it make sense to a layman in understanding how he's going to file the income tax return. So thank you very much for having this one more session on the analysis. And I would invite Ravindra Bhai first to please. But before that, I do the honors in welcoming both the speakers with a floral welcome and a memento. Sir, over to you. Would you prefer from there or here? Yeah.
Good evening, everybody. And it's a pleasure to, interact on this forum. Although this is for the first time that I'll be talking about budget in this forum. It used to be my elder brother and my teacher, Professor.
Second time also. Ekvar Bakulbhai ત્યાં હતા ત્યારે પણ you had taken his place.
I don't remember. Anyway. Okay, now, it is always difficult to step into my brother's footsteps. I have been experienced to do that very often at IIM also and here also. But it's a pleasure because, this is a kind of a budget where there are lots of hope, there are lots of aspirations, and there are lots of problems also, in a way. So this was not a straightforward kind of a walk for any finance minister, or I would not say only finance minister because she is the one who presents the budget, but the whole team is behind her who prepare the budget. So whenever I say something about finance minister or I say something about the Ministry of Finance, please note I'm really referring to the budget makers, the guys who are making the budget. And that is something which at the outset I am saying that it is not a personal kind of a reference, it is more of the reference to the budget making team. Okay. Now, whenever we talk about the next slide, whenever we talk about the macroeconomic analysis of the budget, it would entail the following things. And that is how I have actually, outlined my entire talk. I organized my talk in this way. The first and foremost part which we should really address is the plausibility of assumptions about inflation, growth, and exchange rates, which are always implicit in the preparation of any budget, whether it is at the household level or whether it is at a national level or whether it is at a state level. These three things have to be assumed. These three things have to be considered. The values, quantitative values are important. Otherwise, qualitative things will not work. So what are the assumptions and whether the assumptions made are plausible? Plausible in the sense that whether they are feasible, they are practical, and they are pragmatic. That is the kind of the things that we will be talking. The second one is progress on the fiscal consolidation path. Now, fiscal consolidation path is a word which is being used very often because of the simple reason that we have the problems which were created willy-nilly for whatever reasons in the past, which has driven us to a situation where the debt levels are very high. I'm talking about the public debt to GDP ratio. Okay, this is the general way in which we measure the debt and say whether the debt is sustainable or not. And if the debt is not sustainable, the problem is that whatever debt we create, we have to pay interest on that. And if the interest payments keep rising and rising and rising, ultimately a day will come when we have to borrow in order to pay interest. And that makes the life extremely miserable. It is called a vicious circle of debt. So that trap. I think that is the reason why whenever there is a reform agenda, on the fiscal front, the reform agenda implies fiscal consolidation. And that is the path that I am talking about. There are several well laid down criteria for the fiscal reforms and fiscal consolidation path. The next thing is about credibility of fiscal math. This is something which fiscal math, of course, without fiscal math, you can't prepare the budget. So the budgeting exercise necessarily gets into the details about exact preparation of the numbers. And it is that fiscal math which has to be very carefully diagnosed. And really, you have to really come to that point where we say whether the fiscal math is having the credibility or not. Are there anything which are not credible? Because in that context, it entirely entails the final impact of the budget on the macroeconomy. The final thing is estimate of personal income taxation, tax evasion, and the budget. Because this I have kept it at the end because this is something on which I have worked, and fortunately or unfortunately I can say that before 31st December 2022, when my paper got published in EPW, I can safely say that the dimension of the problems were not known in the country. So I am for the first time trying to put my neck out and calculate and say that these are the kind of the tax evasion that is going on. If the tax evasion is going on, then the budget in the light of this makes what kind of sense? And of course, I'm keeping this at the end because it will be a good type of a bridge for Mukesh Bhai to take over. I think that is the sense in which I am doing. Now, next, we start with the plausibility of assumptions. The inflation. What is the assumption in this budget? The assumption in this budget is essentially that the nominal growth of GDP is assumed to be 10.5%. It's important to realize that in the last budget, the assumption was 11.1%. It was made at a time when it was thoroughly implausible. It was thoroughly impossible because they had assumed that the GDP will grow around 7% and the inflation rate will be around 3.6 to 3.7%. When you combine the two and take into account the cross effect, it becomes 11.1%. If I remember it correctly, and you guys should also remember it correctly, because Bakul Bhai, my elder brother, had from this forum itself had categorically said on the 2nd February 2022 that this assumption is not making sense and that we are going to clock something like 16 to 17% nominal growth. And therefore, most of the calculations and most of the numbers will necessarily get revised. This was there. It so turns out that he was absolutely right. In fact, in the revised estimates, you find that the growth which was assumed was completely off the target. In fact, the actual growth turns out to be something in the range of 15.5%, and 15.5% because the GDP of an earlier year was revised upwards. If you take the same GDP and if you take the growth, it is exactly 17%. So this is something which is very significant. Now, in this context, if we are saying that we are talking about a 10.5% rate of growth, it is essentially bringing down the growth from something like 16 to 17% to 10.5%. That means that there is a slowdown. And this slowdown is not confined only to rectifying the inflation, because the 17% came because 7% was the growth of the GDP and about 8.5% was the growth on part of the inflation. Because the last year was a very high inflation year. Both WPI, that is wholesale price index, and the retail price index both increased significantly. Now the correction is taking place because international prices are, softening and coming down. As a result, you find that both the consumer price index inflation also has come down and is below 6% now. And the WPI inflation has also started coming down. And in fact, for the first time, Economic Survey recognizes that after a long period of time, the inflation by WPI and inflation by CPI are now merging practically at the same number. However, what the Economic Survey has assumed is, and these are the assumptions of the calculation for the budget, that the WPI is going to fall sharply. That means it is already at 5.7, 5.8% by now, but that number is going to go down very sharply. consumer price index may not go down that sharply. In fact, RBI has forecasted that it is likely to be around 5.4, 5.3% or something, and over the whole year, it is likely to be above, hovering above 5%. It will not go down below 5%. This is something which they have said. And I think as far as the CPI is concerned, RBI is more reliable. Now, as far as WPI is concerned, in fact, WPI is more impacted by the international factors. Now, international factors are basically in terms of the war, number one, petroleum prices, number two, and the third thing is slowdown, global slowdown. Since the global slowdown is there, therefore the demand for the basic commodities is not picking up. And therefore, they expect the commodity prices to sharply come down. Not only that, statistically, the last year was a very high inflation in terms of WPI. In fact, the inflation rate was more than 15-20%. As a result, now the time that is coming, you are going to have the serious base effect. So the base effect will bring down the inflation rate artificially. Now, there is likely to be the case, that is what these people have assumed. But please understand, when they are talking about the inflation rate, and let me just come down to the numbers. The nominal GDP of 10.5% is broken down into the real growth of GDP of 6.25%. This is not given anywhere. Please note it. It is 6.25%, which is the real GDP growth. And about 4% is the inflation rate, not in terms of WPI, not in terms of CPI, but in terms of the GDP deflator. And GDP deflator inflation rate is generally obtained as a weighted average of the WPI inflation and the CPI inflation, the weights being 70% for the WPI and 30% for the CPI. If you incorporate this thing, it means that if you consider the entire scenario now in terms of the assumption, plausibility I'm questioning and I'm talking about, if I go by the assumption which they have made of 4% GDP deflator inflation, it implies 5% of the CPI inflation and about 3.6% of the WPI inflation. This is probably going too far. This is assuming too much. In my mind, this is not likely to happen. In fact, the plausibility wise, I question this plausibility right in the front. I am feeling that the inflation rate in terms of the CPI is on an average likely to be more than 5, something like 5.4 or 5.5 on an average for the whole year. And the WPI inflation is also likely to be around 5. That means that I expect the inflation rate not to be 4%, but to be 5%. On the other hand, when we go to the real growth is also considered at 6.25%. This year, which was really a very bad year for the economy, we have clocked 7% rate of growth in real terms. To reduce the rate of growth to something like 6.25 is 3/4 kind of the reduction in the real growth is not justified on several counts. Though these people are arguing at length that why it would be like that. If you read the economic survey in details, then it only talks about certain plausibilities and it doesn't really get into the real convincing arguments. It only says that in the medium term, we can expect 6.5% growth. And if the reforms are carried out, we can expect 7 to 8% growth. Sir, reforms are carried out. So it is not if, they are carried out. Not only that, the global situation and our response to that is also now becoming more and more independent. Since we are now talking about Make in India as a major program, and we are getting Atmanirbhar in several respects. Therefore, and on the other hand, they are recognizing, on the face of it, they are recognizing that the internal demand factors, namely consumption and investments, private investments, are picking up. To top it all, government capital expenditure, government capex, is also for the third consecutive years in a row is clocking a significantly higher rate of growth, something like 33%. Sir, considering all these things, if you feel that it is not likely to be resulting in any tangible outcomes, that means we are wasting the efforts, right? In my opinion, this is absolutely conservative assumption. 6.25. I would say, even conservatively, I would say that we can consider 6.8 to 7% as a rate of growth. 6.8% the economic survey mentions as an upper limit. I would go by the upper limit. I don't want to question them completely. I would say 6.8%. If you take a 6.8% and 5%, sir, the nominal growth rate is likely to be in the range of 12.2%, which means we are in for another surprise like this year. We are likely to have a nominal growth of 12.2% or so, which implies that most of their calculations for the tax revenues and other things, which will come at a later stage, and we will discover that they have assumed a buoyancy of 1. Again, highly conservative assumption. Highly conservative assumption. Buoyancy of 1. That means tax growth will be exactly the same as the income growth. There will be no, rewards to the extra efforts that they make to bring the additional taxpayers into the net or get additional income into the net. Assuming that nothing of this thing happens, it's a buoyancy of 1. Now, if that happens, it only means that we are likely to have another 1.5% minimum, maybe more, of the extra tax revenues which will get generated. That means that whatever calculations and whatever numbers are there, we have to take it with the pinch of salt. That they are conservative numbers, and very often you discover when you interact with the bureaucrats, the guys who are generally in the making of the budget, involved in the making of the budget, these people prefer to be conservative. Why? Because their performance is basically dependent on whether they achieve the final number or not. Like, say, for instance, this year, 6.4% fiscal deficit target has been exactly achieved, 6.4%. So therefore, fiscal marksmanship is excellent. People pour praises. Sir, what has happened actually? In terms of the fiscal deficit, the gap in absolute terms has actually increased in proportion. So the fiscal deficit numbers in rupees trillions has actually increased by 1 trillion. And yet we are saying we have met the target. Why? Because they had underestimated the growth so significantly, by 50%. Sir, this is testing the blood. You have tested the blood. So now you are getting the same repeat. The repeat is that we might actually get into this kind of the numbers next year. So this is a possibility. The final thing is about exchange rate. Please understand what is the exchange rate. I mean, by and large, people don't talk about this. They don't relate that budget with the exchange rate assumption. But exchange rate assumption is necessary and is necessarily implicit in your numbers. Customs duty, for instance. Customs duty is a consideration based on three things: growth of the quantity of imports, growth of import prices, and the exchange rate increase or decrease. If you combine these three, you get the customs duty growth. Customs duty growth is assumed to be exactly 10.5%. Buoyancy 1. What does that mean? It means that if you assume that the import intensity does not reduce or increase, then your growth of imports in physical terms will be the same as 6.25%. And your inflation, on an average, will apply to that also. Therefore, the inflation rate of 4% will be there, and therefore, the total growth will be 10.5%. In that case, you are assuming that exchange rate will be absolutely stable and steady. Most unlikely to happen. Because Fed, the central bank of the US government, has only yesterday increased further the rate. And it says that this is not the end of the cycle. It is going to go on. Sir, if it is going to go on, there will be an upward pressure on the rupee-dollar exchange rate. That means that we are actually expecting some kind of the depreciation. If our inflation rate is likely to be around 5%, their inflation target is around 2%, in that case, you do expect about 3% depreciation anyway. If there is a 3% depreciation, sir, it only implies that 3% depreciation, 5% the import prices increase. That means that practically you are assuming that the import quantity growth would be only 2.5%. This is again a disaster. So these assumptions don't make sense at all. However, in all due respect, ultimately it is the total budget that we have to see. But I have my serious problems about the underlying assumption right at the outset. Okay? So this is one part. This is one part of the analysis of the budget, which I'll say. What is most significant to understand is, if everything was predicted and assumed on the basis of the past and recent past trends, then the whole question is, why do we have budget? What is the implication of the budget on the growth? What is the implication of the budget on the inflation? What is the implication of the budget on the exchange rate? Sir, on the other hand, the proposals contained in the budget are significant. They are going to impact the growth very positively. They are not likely to impact the inflation very significantly. Inflation will be determined more by the external factors. And the exchange rate is again likely to be influenced by the bilateral factors. Given these things, my understanding is that in the next year, when we again meet here, maybe at that time Professor Bakul Dholakia will be here. So at that point in time, probably you would again say the same thing, that the assumptions were too conservative and actuals are coming out to be more favorable. Okay, next. Now let us talk about the fiscal reforms and consolidation. Sir, fiscal reform requires what? Fiscal reform requires less government. It's a very important thing. The private sector, in fact, the whole purpose of the reform was to make it more transparent, more open, more competitive, and in order to have that competitiveness, you need to encourage private sector. That means you need to provide fiscal space to the private sector. So the fiscal space to the private sector means the government should reduce its presence. One way of reducing the presence is to reduce the government expenditure as a proportion of GDP. If that is happening, it is called the sticking to the reform path. If that doesn't happen, it's a deviation. Committed expenditures, another very relevant thing. It requires that the committed expenditures, because this is something like first charge on your thing. Whatever are your income, the first charge are the expenditures which you have to make, you are committed to make. There is no way. You are obliged to do that. In that context, the question is that the committed expenditures as a proportion of the total income should come down. And simultaneously, because proportion of the committed expenditure can come down, so also the proportion of the discretionary expenditure can also come down, and therefore the whole proportion of expenditure can come down. Sir, that is not reform. The reform is that the discretionary expenditures, which is developmental expenditures and all that, should actually increase as a proportion. If this happens, the reforms are on path. The third thing is, the second thing is, fiscal consolidation requires what? Reduce fiscal deficit as well as debt. That is, fiscal deficit as a proportion of GDP and debt as a proportion of GDP, both should decline. Because both are rather high in our country. The next thing about the fiscal consolidation is, it is not just enough to reduce the deficits, fiscal deficit and all that. You need to improve, or you need to have better quality of fiscal deficit. What is the quality of fiscal deficit? Quality of fiscal deficit is the capital expenditures which you finance out of the deficit. So that is the kind of a thing you must really increase the proportion. Higher capex is what is implied. So if that is happening, we are consolidating on the right path. Next. Now this is the budget at a glance. What I have done is, there are several items which are listed out. Then 22-23 budget estimate I have given. First in rupees trillion, the second as a proportion of the GDP at that time. Okay? Then to 22-23 revised estimates, because that is now, it's a revised estimate. Again, rupees trillion and proportion of the revised GDP, okay, which is there. And finally, 23-24 budget estimates, which is again rupees trillion and as a percentage of GDP for that year. Okay? Now you can see for yourself that compare the 22-23 revised estimates with the budget estimate for 23-24. And what you find is that the first part, total expenditures of the government, is actually falling. So that means we are sticking to the reform path. We are not deviating at all. There was a deviation which was there marginally from the budget estimate to the revised estimate. But from the revised estimate to the next year's budget estimate, we are again coming back to the reform path. The next thing is committed expenditures. Sir, this is very relevant. You can see for yourself, if you look at the numbers turn out to be 24.4 and 24.3 trillion rupees, but in terms of the percentage of GDP, it is 6.40,
8.93 and 8.02.
yeah, 8.93 and 8.02, yes. 8.93 and 8.02, significant reduction in the committed expenditures as a proportion of GDP. This is the major fiscal correction. And we would like to understand how this has happened. Because this is a major kind of fiscal correction. On the other hand, you find that the discretionary expenditures have significantly improved. Have significantly improved, that from something like
6.4 to 6.9.
yeah, it is a significant improvement, and therefore you can see that a large part, something like 91 basis point, was the decrease in the government, committed expenditure, and 50 basis point is the increase in the discretionary expenditure. This makes the budget very special, because this is exactly adhering to the reform path. And this is very important because, sir, this requires very, very harsh decisions which have been taken but not spelt out enough in the budget speech. This is the requirement to understand that these are harsh decisions. Sir, it is not a soft budget. It's a harsh budget. It's a tough budget. And tough budget in the election year, before election year, is a matter of political credit. One would give political, bonuses on this issue. They have not been, succumbing to the popular demand. There is no populism at all. This is what it means. The next thing is turning out to be the effective capex. Effective capex has substantially increased in the budget thing. This is again a very creditable thing. Next to that thing is that we have the revenue receipts, which are again rising. So if you say the revenue receipts which come from the tax and non-tax revenues, they are significantly rising. So that is also a part of the reform process. We are adhering to that. And then you have the red. This is exactly the point. That less government could be either in terms of the government expenditure or in terms of the privatization of the existing public sector undertakings. So the numbers in the red, which I am mentioning, are the numbers which are actually showing that there is a significant, although its contribution is on margin, but on margin, it has not been given enough weightage. That means there is a recognition of the fact that this is a budget prior to the election. That is, the next year there is an election. This year, I don't want to create political turbulence. That is the reason why I am not going very strong on privatization. Our privatization experience has also not been very good. So only 61,000 crores have been provided for this thing. This is much less, and actually it shows a decline. This is going against the reform. Okay, that is one part. Then the next thing is about, what are the things?
Non-debt capital.
Non-debt capital receipt is the same thing. Then fiscal deficit is again coming down, which is very relevant. It is important. And that is the sense in which this budget at a glance gives you the idea that we are following the reform path for the fiscal development. Other than that, there is also something which needs to be understood. And this is a serious problem with Indian public finance. The serious problem with the Indian public finance is that you find that the numbers that I have highlighted in the green it shows that this is the non-defense discretionary expenditures. Now, compare all through budget of last year, revised budget figures for the last year, and the budget figure for this year. Sir, compare this to the fiscal deficit figures. I would rather like to point this out to all my professional colleagues who have been senselessly and sometimes very emotionally and passionately arguing for very fast, very rapid fiscal consolidation, that the fiscal deficit should come down. I would rather like to point this out to them. What does that imply? Sir, had we not got the fiscal deficit in the last year budget and the revised budget figures, there would not be any discretionary expenditures at all. Because all your revenues and all your non-debt creating capital receipts are together not sufficient to meet the committed expenditures. So if you don't have that kind of a thing, if your committed expenditures are more than your revenue receipts and the non-debt capital receipts, sir, what are you talking about the developmental, the programs and projects and other things? Can you build a bridge? Can you build a road? Can you build a hospital? Can you build a school? Can you have the drinking water project? Can you have any other irrigation project or anything? No. So the only way in which India can have this kind of expenditure is by borrowing and increasing the fiscal deficit. This is the tragedy of the Indian public finance. In this budget, for the first time you find that the discretionary expenditures are more than the fiscal deficit. That means only a part of discretionary expenditures are financed by borrowing, but some part of the discretionary expenditures are now met out of the regular revenue receipts. This is something which is important, that we are returning back to the normal. Otherwise, it was a tragedy. So this is something which is very significant to understand. Okay, this is what I consider that this is a very significant slide in that sense of the term. We have to see this. Now the next slide is on the debt deficit and interest rates. This is a very relevant matter, sir. For the year 2021-22, 22-23 budget, 22-23 RE and 23-24 budget estimate, the debt to GDP ratios are the ones that that I have mentioned. It is systematically coming down from 57.4% to 56.2%. Unfortunate part is that between the revised estimate of 55.9% and the budget estimate for the next year, 56.2%, there is a marginal increase. This increase has happened because the denominator is deliberately depressed, as I was talking about. If you consider the denominator to be normal, this will not occur. That means you are on the path otherwise. But because you have deliberately depressed the estimate of the GDP growth, this is what is happening, that your debt is actually marginally rising. In spite of your completely narrowing down and bringing the fiscal deficit into control. In spite of that, this is happening. So on the whole, I would say fiscal consolidation is going on the path. There is no issue. The issue is that if you achieve higher growth in nominal terms, most of the fiscal consolidation will take care of itself. You don't need any other special effort. All that you require is growth. That means for India, what is the priority? Sir, you might have been reading in the newspapers that there is a trade-off between fiscal consolidation and growth. Sir, there is no trade-off. For the understanding people, there is no trade-off. Higher growth will automatically take care of the fiscal consolidation. It is only when the growth suffers that the fiscal consolidation becomes a big problem. That means there is nothing to really worry about. Just go ahead and have higher growth. That's all. That is the focus. That is the priority. The next thing is very relevant. Effective average interest cost to central government is actually increasing. And this is no surprise, because RBI is increasing the interest rate, repo rate, like left, right and center. Why? Because Fed is doing that. If that is the kind of the logic that we have, if the Fed tomorrow goes and falls in the deep sea, we are also likely to do that. Now I think there must be some sense prevailing that we should stop increasing the rates anymore. In fact, I have been arguing that for the last 2 times, that we need not increase the rate now. We can pause, wait, watch, and then take the decision. But we have been increasing. Now that increase in the rate, repo rate and other things, have a definite bearing on the cost of interest cost on the government borrowing. And average, you understand, it is not a marginal thing. It is not the thing on which you borrow right now. Average interest rate is going up by 20 basis points. Sir, this is not a small thing. That is the reason why the interest payment is rising. Next. Now let me come to the fiscal math. So the fiscal math is again given in the same 3 kind of things. Last year's budget estimates, last year's revised budget estimates, and then next year's budget estimates. What we see is the interest payment, which is a committed expenditure. You can't do anything with that. You have to make it. Then you have the pay and pension. Pay and pension. In fact, many people accept that pension is a very important thing, but pay may not be it may be discretionary. Sir, that is wrong. Given our labor laws, given the unions in the government organizations, sir, pay and pension both are committed expenditures. You can't do anything about that in the short run. Then you have the food subsidy. I have not considered all subsidies. I have not considered the fertilizer subsidy, and I have not considered the petroleum subsidy, because food subsidy is based on the Food Security Act. Act means your commitment. You are obliged. The act for a change. I'm surprised sometimes, it's a great amusement that in our act we are specifying the prices in rupees. The act says that the rice will be available for 3 rupees per kg and wheat will be available for 2 rupees per kg. No matter whether you are talking about 1970, whether you are talking about 1980, whether you are talking about 2020, or whether you are talking about 2030. Does it make sense, sir? Now, 1 rupee coin is out of the circulation practically. Now, nobody talks about 2 rupees and 3 rupees. And yet, our act talks about this. That means that we are having this as a matter of committed expenditure. That committed expenditure, I have put them into that. The next thing is the Finance Commission grants to the states, which is given as an award by the Finance Commission and you have accepted in the Parliament. So it becomes a committed expenditure. I am not talking about other grants. They are not considered. They are all discretionary. These are not discretionary. They are absolutely committed. Then you have GST compensation fund. While making people agree on the GST, you had given them the promise that if your growth of GST revenue is less than 14%, center will compensate. Center will compensate. At that point in time, the rate of inflation was 2% and 2.5%. And the rate of growth itself was coming down. So our nominal growth was in the range of 9 and 10%, and we had committed that the growth of GST revenue should be 14%. So that is how you had to create the fund. And that contribution to the fund is a committed expenditure. There is no other excuse. And finally you have the total committed expenditure, just the total of all these things. Add to that the defense. Given our neighbors, sir, you think that the defense expenditure is a discretionary in genuine sense of the term? There has to be some kind of the commitment to that. And I would consider, therefore I always put committed expenditure plus defense, because you can't do anything with that. If you consider all these things, you have the non-defense discretionary expenditures, which is the last column, which is the last row. Now look at this thing, sir. What is the fiscal math? As I was telling you, there is a huge decline, huge correction in the committed expenditure as a proportion of GDP. From where does it come? Wonderful to see all the red items that I have put there. It is a shocking thing that in absolute terms, the pay and pension takes $5 trillion in the current year, 2022-23 revised estimates. Okay? This has overshot the budgeted number. On the other hand, this budget talks about bringing it down to 4 trillion rupees, cutting by 20%. And in terms of the proportion of GDP, it is brought down from 1.83 to 1.33. Sir, this 50 basis point come only from cutting the pay and pension. I don't think this is plausible at all. This is not even defensible, sir, because pension is a fixed liability. That means that whatever curtailment that you are talking about is not in the pension, it is in the salaries. What is the implication of this budget, sir? Nobody has gotten into this kind of details. Therefore, the question is that if you look at the numbers appear very, very brilliant. But then, these are the cockroaches there. Then I would say the food subsidy. Food subsidy is now being proposed to cut down so heavily from 1.05% of the GDP to something like 65 basis point. Another significant reduction of something like 40 basis point. So 50 basis point in pay and pension, 40 basis point there, almost everything is taken care of. And on the other hand, you have the Finance Commission grant to the states. That is also being proposed to be cut down. Sir, this committed expenditures, if we are cutting down like this, doesn't appear to be very credible at all. One has to see and one has to justify how are these numbers telling, because what it implies are terrible. But if you grant them, then the rest of picture is fantastic. But if you grant them, that is the basic question. I have my serious doubts about that. What is the defense, sir? The defense is that the pragmatic bureaucrats have already provided for almost 1.5 to 2% cushion for the revenue receipts, because the growth has been understated. If the growth takes care of this thing, these numbers can be taken care of. But then is this the way to prepare the budget? Don't ask me this question. This is how the budgets have been prepared in the past also. This one also is no exception. Okay? Next. As far as the revenue receipts are concerned, it's a fantastic mathematics. Budget math. What is the budget math? Everything is growing at the rate of 10.5%. So that means there is hardly anything which is changing at all. In fact, between revised estimates and budget estimate, the proportions are the same. Income tax, corporate tax, excise, customs, everything put together, everything remains the same. Total revenue receipts, everything. So therefore, it's a situation where you are really finding that if the income estimates keep changing, if the income estimates are not firm, these are also not firm. Okay, so the budget, the fiscal math has a problem. The last slide, the next slide. These are the estimate of the PIT evasion. So I am preparing to hand over the mic to, so don't worry, I have not exceeded my time in a significant way. The estimate of this thing is being for the year assessment year 2018-19, because this is the latest year for which I can get significant amount of data from the income tax department itself. It is their data. Okay, and I have supplemented other data to make this kind of calculations, because it is not available from one source only. You have to put everything together. What is important is total population in the country is about 131.41 crores. During 2017-18 is a financial year. The personal income which is relevant for the personal income taxation is 130.7 trillion rupees at that point in time. Out of that population supported by PIT filers, I have assumed that every PIT filer supports 4 persons including himself. So it's a family of 4 and there is one return. Very conservative assumption, sir. But if I consider that, the total population supported by the PIT filer is 23.15 crores. And their income is 37 trillion. BPL population, who is not supposed to pay the taxes, they are much below the level of income. Their estimation is 35.61 crores and their income is only 7 trillion. Obviously, they are below poverty line. Agricultural landowners again are exempt from filing the income tax returns and all that. Therefore, I have taken their number also, 34.59 and 23 trillion rupees is their income. Non-filers below exemption, those who are not filing returns at all, but their income is below exemption level, right? Then they are not evading. They are simply not required. Is it okay? Their number is also 16.80 crores and 10.5 trillion rupees. If I put all these things and subtract it from the totals, I get non-filers without agricultural lands, but above exempt limit of income, who should be filing returns, who are not filing returns, they are evading the tax. Sir, they are as high as 21.26 crores. Divided by 4, that number is a total number of filers who should be there but who are not there. And their income is whopping 53.1 trillion. Sir, in terms of the proportions, about 16.2% of total population and about 40.7%, 41% of the income is actually evading personal tax in this country. With these numbers, there are several things which are announced in the budget, and my dear friend is going to dwell on that at length, that what are the benefits and what are the kind of the great changes which are made in the current tax regime and all that, and how the equity is and the equality is being addressed. Sir, my concern is, if these people stay away from the tax net, and there is precious little which is done to ensure that any one of these is coming back into the tax net. With this kind of concerns, my only thing is, what are we talking about? The guys who are going to get some benefits, if you total them up, it is around 3.5 to 4 crores, that's all. So for 3.5 to 4 crores, we are having this kind of hung-ho. On the other hand, there are 21.26 crores who are left in the wilderness. And 41% of the personal income is officially recognized in the GDP calculation, but remains completely outside the tax net. These are my concerns. The budget has not addressed this. So I refuse to comment on the impact of budget on the inequality, because it is not making any sense to me in the presence of these numbers. Okay? All said and done, there are hits and misses. I have tried to talk about several of them. Let me tell you, on the whole, this budget is a wonderful budget because it is on the conservative side. There is a room for optimism because like this year, next year also we are going to have good surprise. And probably we are not going to deviate from the fiscal consolidation path, from the fiscal reform path, and that is how we should thank the budget makers, that by not significantly tinkering the things in the other way around, that is, creating nuisance, at least they have avoided creating any nuisance. Therefore, this is a very good budget in the trying times. I thank you here. Thanks.